Greetings and welcome to this edition of Bias Magazine in conjunction with Caribbean Gateway and Lavina Brown. And this week I have some very interesting guests. We're talking about Harold Phillips, and so I have here in the studio his daughter Carol Phillips and Dr. James McGrath, who's going to be talking about Lord Woodbine, Phillips aka Lord Woodbine.
Yeah.
So for a moment then, just take a minute to tell us, who is Lord Woodbine?
Well, Harold Phillips became known as Lord Woodbine on account of his recognition as a calypso singer and songwriter. So musicians such as Lord Kitchener or Lord Fly, the Lord denoted that they were recognised as talented calypsonians. Harold Phillips wrote a calypso featuring characters named after cigarettes. One of those was Woodbine.
Okay.
So that's where the name comes from.
Okay, the Woodbine bit. So where was Harold Phillips? Because we're kind of put this into historical context. So he was somebody who fought in the war, did he?
That's
and then
right.
Come back on the Windrush.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was born in 1929 in Laventille, and he served in the RAF.
Mm-hmm.
He reportedly joined the RAF underage. He took his brother's passport along, and that's how he was able to join in 1943.
Yeah.
And so he served at Burton Wood in Lancashire, and then returned to Trinidad in the late 40s. But then in 1948, on the Windrush, Harold Phillips with Lord Kitchener
That journey.
returned to England. Yes,
Okay.
and he
Ended up in
Liverpool.
Okay.
Yes.
So were they musicians then? Is that what they came here to do? What did they come here to do?
Well, I think part of the reason why Lord Woodbine returned to England was because he'd fallen in love already with Helen, who was later
Your mum.
to become his wife. So Helen was English Nigerian,
Okay.
and I think was from Northumberland. And so so Lord Woodbine he toured around. He toured in Jamaica with Lord Kitchener in 1947, but in the UK he was one of the first calypso musicians and also steel panists to tour, and they played in various universities all around the UK. And it was in the late 1950s in Liverpool that Lord Woodbine met the Beatles, or the Silver Beatles, as they were then known. Yes.
So what effect do you think at the time, because calypso I'm assuming would have been new to the English, so what effect do you think that this kind of new type of music coming from these exotic people would have had on Liverpool at the time?
Well, around 1957, 56, 57, there were various calypso releases in the US and UK. Various singles were released with mixed success, but there was an idea at the time that calypso, and this is something Paul McCartney has described years later, calypso was seen as what was going to be the next big musical event in the UK. John Lennon's first ever composition in 1957 was titled Calypso Rock.
Right.
It was around a year or so after that he and Paul McCartney first met Lord Woodbine, and something important about Woodbine is that he was the first singer-songwriter that the Beatles ever met. So that was quite a distinguished role that he had in their
So it's almost the
history.
reverse, isn't it? We think of it the other way around, I guess, because the Beatles seem to be what comes forward first, but actually it was the other way around.
Yes,
He
yes.
influenced them.
He was, he was, the thing about Lord Woodbine is there are no recordings of his work to have survived. He wasn't a professional recording artist. It was his live presence, in every sense, that remained key to his legacy. So his calypsos that he would write back in Trinidad and then later in Liverpool, they were often topical, referring to various political situations.
Yeah, current affairs and
That's
things like
right,
that.
yes.
Yeah. Okay, so at the time now we've got these musicians from the Caribbean, Lord Woodbine in particular, influencing the Beatles as well as many others.
Yes. I mean, sometimes people have said to me, well, how can we know that this story of Lord Woodbine's role in the Beatles' history is actually true? But it's important to point out that he was not the only black musician in Liverpool to have quite an influence over the young Lennon and McCartney. there was a young Somali-Irish guitarist called Vinnie Ismail, who, amongst many other things, he taught the young Lennon and McCartney Chuck Berry riffs. Now, in the Beatles' repertoire, there are about 16 or 17 Chuck Berry songs, but there were certain techniques that they couldn't quite master. The person who showed them was a young guitarist called Vinnie Ismail, based in Toxteth, or Liverpool 8, as it's also known.
Because Lord Woodbine was also known for teaching the Beatles certain types of music, or how to play the drums and
well, there are, yes, this is something that's been researched, actually, not by myself, that particular aspect. He accompanied them to Hamburg on their first trip there in 1960, and he played on stage as the opening act before the Beatles took to the stage in Hamburg. So he seems to have been a figure who was always keen to help out others. Sorry,
he took them.
Yeah,
Correction.
He took them.
Okay. So let's talk about, because obviously you've researched this and you've dug through material, and there's hundreds of books written about the Beatles, but very little mention about Lord Woodbine and so on. So how seriously do you think the history was then about these Caribbean people that came here, and why do they seem to be sort of coincidental to be mentioned and not necessarily, their full impact on the music, sort of acknowledged?
Most books about British music, and in particular most books about the Beatles, are authored by white men. That includes myself. I think that there are comparable patterns perhaps that you can see in books about the Beatles, where actually the women around the Beatles tend to be dismissed. If you think about Yoko Ono's influence on John Lennon, was absolutely massive, but the white male author pattern becomes a problem there, because people turn Yoko Ono into a kind of joke figure, which is actually very offensive.
Seriously,
The Beatles didn't actually talk about these black Liverpool influences as much as they might have done in public, although there are, if you look through the interviews in later years, there are quite a few mentions. I think part of the problem is that journalists haven't actually asked the Beatles.
Yeah, well, there is that too. That question probably hasn't been asked as well.
Yes.
So at the time, now I'm trying to get a feel for the time, because we are talking about the UK in the 60s, and we know that there were segregation and all these other things going on.
Yes.
So when the Beatles are playing, I'm understanding that there was some kind of politics behind whether they would play in a segregated bit. So did they sort of stand by the black musicians that influenced them, or did they kind of forge ahead anyway without them?
Well, the Beatles did take a very clear stance against segregation. When they first, on all of their tours of America, they refused to play in front of any audience where there was segregation. First arriving in the US in early 1964, when they were given about 15 interviews a day, whenever they were asked about who were their favourite American recording artists, it was Motown and the slightly older R&B, Chuck Berry and Little Richard in particular. So the Beatles' stance regarding segregation was that they were always very much anti-segregation. And looking at interviews from the period, although Lennon was more obviously the political Beatle, that was actually in later years, whereas at the time, and I was quite surprised by this, and I think other people might be too, but in the UK and US media, it was actually mostly McCartney who spoke out against the kind of atmosphere that they would encounter in America
at the time,
with segregation. Yes.
Okay. So bringing it back to today and Lord Woodbine and his legacy, as Carol sitting here, part of his legacy. What influence do you think he may have today on music? I mean, you've found him, you've studied the Beatles, you've stumbled across him, found him quite interesting.
Yes.
So how do you think that might kind of affect today and the future of music?
Well, I suppose one thing is, to go back to what I was saying before about it tends to be a white-dominated history. When we're talking about the avant-garde, when we're talking about being experimental, trying out new things, forging new directions. Lord Woodbine was doing those things in the 1940s and the 1950s. How he would develop calypso in the UK in relation to topical events in Liverpool. So wherever there is innovation, in that sense, there's a legacy. And also, if you think about the Beatles, you know, they took so much from all around the world and made it into a style that was their own too. They were very original.
Unique, yes, they were.
So with the sitar, with electronic tape effects and things, they were always on the lookout for different things they could add to their sound. My point is that started in Liverpool, and Liverpool's...
Can you talk about the steel pan?
Yes, the steel pan. So Woodbine led the All Caribbean Steel Band in Liverpool in the early to mid 50s. They were one of the first steel bands in Britain and would and toured in various universities, various towns and cities. The Winston Spree Simon was one of the members, along with Woodbine. So Spree Simon, a vital, massive figure in the history of steel pan.
And then today now we find that Lord Woodbine has been nominated on the Power List that you mentioned. Yeah. So is that well, the Power List is a publication that comes out once a year, I believe, to acknowledge the most significant. So he's been nominated as one of the most influential musicians.
As one of the 10 most influential musicians.
10, yes. So that's quite an achievement. Okay. Well, what we'll do now is if you could give off your website so that people can contact you if they want more information.
Yes.
And have a read, because you've done your PhD on this and
That's
so on,
right,
so they can
yes.
read various things that you've put up online.
My website, the best way to find my website is enter Lord Woodbine Academia, and there you'll get a list of the different publications that I have put together with the vital help of key interviewees, because I wasn't born at this time. It's the generosity of people who've shared their knowledge and their memories with me that have sort of those central to those publications.
We have to give thanks to you for finding these stories and trying to find a way to tell them as well. So James McGrath, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Carol Phillips, thank you very much for sharing your stories about Lord Woodbine, Harold Phillips. Thank you. So that's it for this edition of Bias Magazine. So until next time, peace, love and light. Back into the studio with Lena.